Origin just UX, and this is how NATO and Russia are preparing to fight total war, part 2, I guess. You already did the first portion of this some time ago, a few days ago, I don't know. And yeah, sometimes real life lore videos is like so long, and if the origin video doesn't get enough views, I usually don't even bother or something, or sometimes I even forget, right? But yeah, I guess enough people told me to finish this, so okay, let's do this. Yeah, so first portion was like an obvious thing about why NATO and Russia are preparing to fight, right? The usual things that people generally know about. Why France is preparing, like France is like, if Russia keeps expanding, France would be at bigger risk, right? When it comes to European conflicts, usually it's like Germany, France, and UK are the one who's involved, right? So far with the Ukraine, there was like, wait a minute, where this is going? It never stopped. And now Russia is like a war economy type of thing where they make money through war equipment and things. So people are going to panic, obviously, because Europe, so after the World War II, Europe has been in somewhat peace condition, at least the major players. But after Russia, Ukraine thing, if Russia keeps expanding, the three powers that like France, UK, and Germany would have to like do something. Germany already, like, as soon as Ukraine Russia thing started, Germany already declared like, okay, we are arming ourselves or something like that. That was first since World War II. Japan is doing some similar things as well now because of their own thing, right? So I don't know. Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. Remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe. So that way I know which type of videos to react to more. I do many different type of reactions. So YouTube algorithm sometimes goes crazy. So liking and commenting will help out this channel great. So let's watch one.
Russian-speaking city of Narva.
Wait a minute, first one was right.
Or turning it into a de facto independent separatist state, repeating their previous limited invasions to prop up separatist entities into Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Russian propaganda would flood the West with disinformation asserting that Narva, like Crimea and other parts of Ukraine, should rightfully belong to Russia on the basis of the city being predominantly inhabited by ethnic Russians. If Estonia were to then trigger NATO's Article 5 over the loss of Narva, how many other countries in NATO would really be willing to risk a major war with Russia over the fate of a Russian-speaking city like Narva? If most NATO countries didn't respond forcefully enough to the limited attack, then what would happen to NATO's credibility? If NATO's credibility as a defense alliance was eroded, then would Russia grow further emboldened to seize more of the Baltic states later?
That is such a great point, right? NATO countries are not gonna suddenly go to full-on war because of Narva, but then again, that would be the pivotal point. If they don't do, like, first they came for Narva, for the Russian-speaking cities, I didn't speak up. Then they came for some smaller countries, I didn't speak up. Now they came for me, and it's like a nuclear war out there. I don't know what to do. It feels like, it's just for the present, like, just because it's a NATO country. In advance, people should like give warnings that don't go after this city, otherwise NATO has a war or something. And if it does happen, NATO has to get involved, because where do you draw a line? There has to be a hard line. Like, doesn't matter what, you shouldn't touch NATO countries. The first portion of this video that I watched obviously talked about how there is a paragraph that doesn't point blank says that NATO countries have to fight or something, right? It just implies that it could be any type of answer or something. The interpretation can be anyway, but in the end doesn't matter. You have to answer, otherwise it's just like it gives a message to basically anyone. Like, if you attack NATO country but something that's economically and military wise not that powerful, and I guess NATO won't do anything type of way.
Later, as they've done with Crimea and then more of Ukraine. If the Russians opted to initiate a full-scale invasion of the Baltic states instead before or after seizing Narva, they might be able to overrun all three countries within only hours or days. The Baltic states are not very big, and they're almost completely surrounded by Russian and Belarusian territory and the Baltic Sea. Russian forces could invade them by land from three different directions, and there's nowhere really for Baltic-based troops to retreat towards. In the opening weeks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, the Russians managed to militarily occupy roughly 54,000 square miles of Ukrainian territory, which is about 80% of the same area as the three Baltic states combined. If the Russians decided to eventually invade the Baltic states, they would rapidly advance towards major ethnic Russian-majority cities like Narva in Estonia and Daugavpils in Latvia, while the primary objective of the Russian Baltic fleet based in Kaliningrad would be to quickly secure control over the sparsely populated Estonian island of Hiiumaa. There were only 9,000 people who live on this island, So, if the Russians were able to seize control over it quickly, they could set up anti-access area denial, or A2D2 weapon systems on the island like anti-air and anti-ship missiles, and transform it into a military outpost between their separated territories of St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, with the intent of keeping their own maritime supply lines open, and denying NATO the ability to intervene with air power or naval assets from Finland, Sweden, or Poland. Meanwhile,
Yeah, this feels so, just like lucrative in itself, like how easy it can be for the Russia. Just looking at it, like if they do this, it's like really perfect situation for Russia. I know that, like they probably thought about it. Like if we win Ukraine or anything after Ukraine, we are going to do this sometime. Now I'm convinced there must be a plan like this. This is insane. Look at that. It makes it much easier for them afterwards, right? It's always like once you capture something, then what? This is what, right? It's like gives a great, monopoly to them, right? Advantage to them.
Russian ground troops would attempt to rapidly advance from Kaliningrad and Belarus in a pincer attack to seize control over the highly strategic Suwalki Gap, the roughly 100-kilometer wide choke point between Kaliningrad and Belarus that is the only geographically available land connection between the Baltic states and Poland, and therefore between the Baltic states and the rest of NATO and the EU. If the Suwalki Gap was seized quickly by the Russians, in addition to strategic islands like Hiiumaa, then the Russians would effectively encircle the Baltic states and cut them off from being easily resupplied or reinforced from the rest of NATO. In 2016, the RAND Corporation, an American think tank, ran several simulations that concluded with the availability of NATO troops in the area at the time. A surprise Russian offensive on the Baltic states could see Russian tanks rolling through the streets of the Estonian and Latvian capitals within only 36 to 60 hours after the invasion began, while Lithuania's capital is only a mere 30 kilometers away from the border with Belarus. If they were successful with taking over the Baltic states this rapidly, then the Russians would attempt to present NATO with a situation known as a fait accompli. The Russian occupation of the Baltic states would already be accomplished, and there would be no reversing this fact unless NATO decided to go to war with Russia over the issue, which would have the potential to escalate into a nuclear confrontation. And then would come the decision for the people living in NATO countries. Would they be willing to go to war and potentially die over the status of the Baltic states? Or would they more or less accept the new reality?
There was a recent thing about nuclear, nuclear calendar. I know that was from Russian side, like what they're thinking about it, like how to use nuke and things. They already have something like that in place. So that's, I don't know, man. In that, plan that they were talking about like how to use that tactically in this and that. Now, every time we hear that, we think, oh, nuke, of course they're not going to use it. We think about the Japan, the first two bombs that were dropped, or like Zara bomb and things like that, like Castle Bravo. We think about all this when we think about nukes, right? But that's not really the case in today's world. Nukes can range from smallest to biggest. Of course, even the smallest nuke's going to have like devastating consequence. But it doesn't have to be massive city level nukes, right? So it could be some selective targets here and there, some outside of the city targets. Basically, if somebody wanted to use nuke, they can do it. Only problem with that would be that, violating treaties. But at this point, Russia probably doesn't care, right? And it, like I said, it's slippery slope, right? With when I talked about Russia going for the Baltic state and things like that. What if NATO doesn't respond? That just sets the precedent. Like, when you're going to draw the line? Same thing could apply to nuke. Russia might try to see, let's see what people do. Right? Let's see if I use smaller nukes far away from populated area, some strategic target or something. What are people's response? What is NATO's response? And then slowly they could just escalate from there. And before we know it, nukes is a weapon now that people use, and treaty no longer applies. That's a very fucked up thing. Because only thing when it comes to nukes right now is just like point blank, you can't use it. Doesn't matter how small. Once you start using it, city destroying nukes might not be that far of a thing in the future, because that's how it is. It's like slowly you reach that point. You can't just directly jump to that point. Then it becomes a problem. Then it's a deterrent, right? Only where Russia can fear retaliation if they just launch a massive nuke. Then they have to worry what if somebody else nukes us. But if they slowly approach that, right, and then they could nuke some non-nuclear power country or something. See, this is the whole thing. That's the one thing I'm fearing. Slowly they might get there. And how fast people's response, how strong people's response are, that's where the thing's going to be.
If Article 5 of NATO wasn't resoundingly heeded by many of NATO's members, then the European Union contains a separate mutual defense clause within its own Treaty on the European Union that is arguably even more strongly worded than NATO's mutual defense clause is. Article 42.7 of the Treaty on the European Union reads, verbatim, if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power. That phrase, by all the means in their power, is substantially more strongly worded than NATO's Article 5, that only reads, by such action as it deems necessary. All three Baltic states are also members of the EU, and so, in theory, a Russian attack on them would also trigger the EU's built-in mutual defense pact as well. But the problem is that the EU is a significantly less formidable military power than NATO is. In comparison to NATO, the EU excludes the United States, Canada, Iceland, Norway, Turkey.
Yeah, but one leads to other, isn't it? Like, if the EU has that thing, like they have to like respond, and they do respond. EU includes France and Germany and places like that. Then in response, Russia attacks them. Now NATO has to intervene. So one leads to another, isn't it? It's just like weird chain of things.
Turkey, North Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, and since Brexit, the United Kingdom as well. As a result, the defense budget of all EU member states is a whopping 80% less than the defense budget of all NATO member states, largely because the EU excludes the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and Turkey. On its own, the EU will be significantly less capable of responding to a Russian attack on a member state than NATO will be. And while a Russian attack on the Baltic states is almost certainly nowhere near imminent, there is a substantial amount of growing alarm that if Russia emerges victorious in Ukraine, it could only become a matter of time. How much time it might be is open to a significant degree of speculation. In January of 2024, Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius warned that Europe could face a direct war with Russia within 5 to 8 years after the conclusion of the war in Ukraine, if it ends on Moscow's terms. The next month in February, Denmark's defense minister gave an even more dire warning, claiming that Russia could test Article 5 in NATO solidarity with an attack on a member state within 3 to 5 years from the present. General Sir Patrick Sanders, the Chief of Staff of the British Army, warned in January of 2024 that Britons and Europeans today may be a part of the pre-war generation, and that Britain must be prepared for a potential war with Russia in the future.
Yeah, Weimar Republic, right? So how Weimar Republic was, and you think like they were insanely poor. How the hell that went from the Nazi Germany, right? There's many economical things there. Obviously Hitler and Nazi Germany basically took a lot of steps that would imply if they don't win, they're gonna collapse because they weren't planning on losing, right? So there was many things, but still they actually reached the point where there could be threat to the entire world, right? Single-handedly, right? At least to the most of the Europe. Germany being single-handedly bigger threat than anything else after all that, after the collapse and everything. So, it's slowly built to that, right? First, Hitler attacks something here and there, small phase here and there. People like, maybe, just like, yeah, there's some diplomatic thing there, this and that. How we are thinking about Russia and Ukraine thing now. It's just Ukraine. Maybe, Russia won't do anything more, this and that. We are thinking that was the same mentality back then, right? Then slowly it reached that point. Right, so like this guy says here, it feels like a pre-war era right now. If this keep escalating, I can see like countries butting head and World War III starting. And how Cold War was cold when people didn't anticipate being cold, but because of nukes and things turn out to be cold because there was no precedent like that before. Wars didn't used to be cold like that. People are assuming World War III is going to be like nuclear wasteland type of way, like that's it. But maybe not. Maybe the things that would end everything, people who are fighting knows that and will never use that. They want to get something done. They don't want to just die. So maybe World War III was just like World War II, but just insanely powerful. Without nations dying in nuclear fallout. Who knows?
Future. The outgoing chief of the Estonian Military Intelligence Agency recently estimated that the Russians could be prepared for a war with NATO within only 4 years after wrapping up their current war in Ukraine. while Poland's National Security Agency has even more aggressively estimated that Russia could attack a NATO member state within only 3 years after the conclusion of the war in Ukraine. These various estimates from senior European military and intelligence agencies suggest that a potential Russian assault on the Baltic states, limited or full scale, could take place within the next 3 to 8 years from today. Or, in other words, sometime between 2027 and 2032 during Putin's current or next term in office. A timeline that roughly lines up with Russia's own apparent goals of wrapping up the war in Ukraine by 2026 and annexing Belarus by 2030. And which also roughly lines up with the expected window of opportunity that China will have to launch their own invasion of Taiwan, projected to be between 2027 when the People's Liberation Army completes its modernization reforms, and 2032 when the 22nd National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party will be held and Xi Jinping will be approaching 80 years old. With these largely aligned timeline of opportunities, it's not inconceivable that if Russia emerges victorious in Ukraine, the Russians and Chinese could later choose to coordinate simultaneous invasions of the Baltic states and
Yeah, see that there's a reason why Hitler was like allying with Japan even though he didn't really like that, because two front wars are really better if you want to fight somebody, right? So China attacking Taiwan, US busy there, other countries are also busy there, and now Russia is like expanding Europe and NATO and other countries are busy as well. We think of NATO budget, this budget, but we need to really understand, like, if you're fighting massive wars on two different fronts, things becomes very different, right? Especially when Russia is transformed into like wartime economy. In few years, 7 or 8 years, they will be geared well when it comes to like war, because war is where they make money, right? So compared to other countries whose economy is different, compared to the countries whose economy is war, right? Them doing war would be better for them, I don't know.
and Taiwan to divide NATO and the West's response and give them each the best possible odds of success. And worst of all, from Europe's perspective, they may have to face this nightmare scenario of defending the sovereignty of the Baltic states without the help of America. Donald Trump could very well become re-elected as the next president of the United States in the upcoming election this November. Trump has long been critical of NATO as an organization and of America's continued membership in the alliance. He rattled European NATO members in February of 2024 when, during a campaign rally, he openly stated that he would encourage the Russians to do, quote, whatever the hell they want to any European NATO member that he deemed to be not spending enough on defense. Back in 2006, NATO adopted a non-binding guideline that member states of the alliance should aim to spend at least 2% of their national GDP on defense per year. But for
people obviously will be fan of Donald Trump and defending comments. I have nothing to say about Trump in general, but that whole statement, like, I'm not gonna do anything about the NATO country who doesn't spend well. First of all, if you think that, then go to NATO meetings, have many meetings, and remove them from NATO. But if they're in the NATO, you have to support them, right? Because that's an a-hole statement, right? We only we'll only help you as far as you have enough money. It's a very businessman statement, like he is New York businessman type of element, right? But that's not how things work at the global scale, right? You've seen in global politics, you have to give sometimes just to receive something. You see that a lot of time in foreign relations, things like that. Donald Trump doesn't understand this at all, right? Donald Trump point blank just says it. If the small country doesn't pay much and is in the NATO, I'm not going to do anything about it. If you think that, pass some things in NATO and try to remove them from NATO, not that, I'm not going to help out, then it just becomes what's the point of NATO at all, right? You're going to do what the hell you want anyway. What's the point of a pact if it's not much of a pact?
For years, hardly any countries in NATO actually followed that guideline. When the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014, only 3 members of NATO met the theoretical 2% of GDP on defense minimum. Military spending in NATO gradually increased from there and then accelerated rapidly after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. By the summer of 2023, 11 members of NATO had increased their defense spending to more than 2% of GDP, with a notable difference in military spending between European countries closer to Russia than those further away. Now in 2024, it appears that potentially 20 of NATO's 32 total members will hit the theoretical 2% of GDP on defense minimum. But the decades of Europe's underspending on defense since the end of the Cold War has left a huge gap in European nations' military stockpiles. Had the European NATO countries followed through with a 2% of GDP defense budget continually since 1991, they'd have an estimated $600 billion worth of additional weapons, munitions, and hardware available today in stockpiles that they don't. So, how would Trump, assuming he returns to the American presidency in 2025, define a European NATO state not spending enough on defense? Would he define even NATO states currently spending 2% of GDP on defense?
Look, here's the thing. This is, NATO states' defense, this is their GDP, right? So all these countries that is showing France and I guess even Germany, France, Germany, these people are below 2% GDP of their economy basically. And Germany is like top 5, right? Is France top 5? I think France is top 5. I don't know. These are top 5 countries. Not to mention top country, which is US, is spending about 2% of there. So US is the highest economy in the world, highest GDP on the world. And they're spending of that more than 2% of that. While Germany and France doesn't. That kind of feels like, okay, this NATO thing mostly will help Europe rather than America, right? Yeah, so, the NATO mostly helps Europe, right? That's why, NATO was founded in the first place. Well, US is also part of it because every time there's World War, USA has to step in. But US is spending more than 2% of its own GDP, which is the highest in the world, while Germany and France not doing it feels weird, right? Like your economy is not as big as USA, but it's like in top 5, and you're supposed to spend 2%, more than 2% of your own GDP, right? So US is spending immensely high in this, while France and Germany doesn't. That feels weird to me. I didn't know this was the case.
As still being delinquent anyway because they had spent decades before 2014 and 2022 underspending on defense. The US Congress quietly passed in a law as a part of the 2024 US defense budget, a restriction on any US president from being able to unilaterally withdraw the United States from NATO, without the approval of the US Senate or an act of Congress first. This was widely viewed as a means of Trump-proofing Washington's commitment to NATO. But many also argue that Trump could be even more dangerous to NATO while keeping America within the alliance, because he could undermine NATO from within. The alliance requires unanimous consent of all its members for just about any significant decision, which Trump could just refuse to give. If Estonia or Latvia were attacked, he could simply choose to respond with only a token gesture like first aid kits or helmets rather than actual.
That's the thing, right? Because the NATO's Article 5 doesn't say how to respond. So whether you stay in NATO or not stay in NATO, Trump can just do this. But one thing I've noticed about Trump, he'll say he'll do a lot of things because he doesn't understand of those things. But when that time does come and enough people actually says to him that this means this means this is what geopolitics is, if we don't do this, this is gonna happen, eventually he'll cave in, right? It's like, what was that? I don't even know. Like, who knew this was so hard or some shit like that? Everybody knew. He makes that kind of statement all the time. So I don't see him not doing, at this scale, not actually getting in, unless he doesn't want to fight Russia or something, that would be different. But yeah, something like that.
American boots on the ground. And with Trump potentially back in charge in Washington again from 2025 through 2029, it roughly lines up with the various European defense ministers' warnings of a Russian timeline for an assault on the Baltic states and a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And if more European countries see nationalist parties rise to power that prioritize their own national interests first over Europe's collective interests, then even more NATO states may essentially refuse to answer an Article 5 call. If Trump's America declines to intervene, then Viktor Orban's Hungary will almost certainly decline to intervene as well. While the incoming nationalist president of Slovakia has already openly stated as recently as April of 2024 that he would oppose sending the Slovak armed forces to assist an attacked NATO member state who triggered Article 5. Large percentages of the populations in many European countries like Hungary, Greece, Italy, Romania, and Austria are already of the opinion that Ukraine should be pressured into suing for peace with Russia. And if Trump wins the US election in November, Putin could likely count on invading the Baltic states after the war in Ukraine is wrapped up, without any significant interventions coming from America, Hungary, and Slovakia at a minimum, and likely from many others as well. So how is Europe preparing to deal with the prospect of a potential Russian invasion of the Baltic states in the future? The Baltics themselves are taking the threat extremely seriously, with the memory of the half a century of Soviet occupation in the 20th century still fresh in their minds. Estonia and Lithuania have continually maintained a system of military conscription ever since their 1991 independence, while Latvia has recently confirmed that they'll be reintroducing their own conscription system. In January of 2024, the defense ministers of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all jointly announced that their countries would begin the construction of the so-called Baltic Defense Line across the entire length of their borders with Russia and Belarus. Estonia has already confirmed that they'll build 600 fortified bunkers along the entire length of their border with Russia, while Latvia and Lithuania are expected to construct thousands of additional bunkers along the entire length of their own borders. The bunkers on the border will be complemented by fortified trenches, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, and anti-tank mines. Initially, Latvia even publicly considered laying anti-personnel landmines across the entire length of their border with Russia and Belarus too. Though, this idea appears to have been shelved for now out of concern for the future of civilians in the border area. The Baltic defense line isn't meant to stop a Russian invasion dead in its tracks like the 21st century version of the Maginot Line. Instead, it is being designed to slow a potential Russian invasion of the Baltic states down just enough to buy enough time for the Western allies to hopefully arrive and stop them from getting overrun completely. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have all pledged to increase their military spending to at least 3% of their GDP, 50% higher than the theoretical minimum required by NATO, while their neighbor Poland is spending even more aggressively. Poland is already upped their own defense spending to about 4% of their own GDP, making Poland the highest military spender.
Poland's like, yeah, you can't even tell. I'm in a whole other level right now. I know the history. I know what happens. As soon as you speak Poland, it's like, oh my God, what's going to happen now? Poland is the most screwed country on the world in any history, right? Like, as far as you can think of, Poland is the most screwed country. Even the time of Catherine the Great and God knows what, right? Poland always gets screwed. So when World War III, as soon as Poland hears World War III starts, the 50% of the GDP could be like military GDP now. Like, who knows?
In all of NATO based on percentage of GDP. Poland's defense minister has openly stated that Warsaw's goal is to build out nothing less than the largest conventional ground force in Europe. They plan to double their military size to 300,000 personnel, and are purchasing tens of billions of dollars worth of hardware and munitions from the United States and South Korea, including 350 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, 96 Apache helicopters, dozens of HIMARS rocket artillery systems, 700 K9 artillery pieces from South Korea, and another 1,000 South Korean Panther tanks. Poland will undoubtedly be determined to use this new military might to keep the Suwalki Gap choke point open at all costs in the event that the Russians end up invading the Baltic states, as it'll be Poland's primary responsibility to funnel NATO or EU reinforcements by land to the military front line. Meanwhile, Sweden and Finland's entries into NATO have been a true game changer, because their large air forces and navies so nearby to the Baltic theater of operations will be tasked with securing air and naval superiority. Sweden's control of the island of Gotland will be particularly important, as it could become transformed into essentially an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Baltic right off the shore of Latvia. They will battle against the Russian Baltic Fleet headquartered in Kaliningrad, and try to sever the maritime connection between Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg, while the Finnish and Swedish air forces, including 64 cutting-edge F-35 fighters in the Finnish Air Force, will attempt to secure air supremacy over the Baltic states themselves. Russia will attempt to stop them by concentrating their anti-access area denial capabilities within Kaliningrad and along their borders with the Baltic states, while they will also try and set up more on the sparsely inhabited Estonian island of Hiiumaa in the opening hours of the conflict breaking out, which the Swedish and Finnish air forces and navies will do everything in their power to prevent from happening. Germany has even further announced their own plans to deploy a fully combat-ready brigade to Lithuania by no later than 2027, the first time that the German army will be permanently deployed to Lithuania since the Second World War, and a force that will all but guarantee the Germans' commitment to defense of the Baltic.
Oh look, Germans here. What the fuck? Oh wait a minute, they are our allies. Oh wait a minute. Germans are here, great. That would be the first time somebody says that in a long time, yeah.
States as well. At the same time, even though 20 out of NATO's 32 member states are expected to finally reach the 2% of GDP on defense spending target this year, in 2024, the Baltic states and many other analysts have insisted that in order to make up for the decades of previous underspending on defense in Europe, and the massive rearming currently going on in Russia, and to hedge against a potential US withdrawal from NATO if Trump is re-elected, European NATO states should really be shooting to up their defense spending to at least 3% of their GDP instead for the foreseeable future, at least through 2030. European NATO states are essentially being faced with a difficult-to-answer dilemma. They can choose between increasing their defense spending for years in an attempt to deter the Russians from ever invading the Baltic states, and in an attempt to keep the United States actually committed to continue protecting them, which will necessitate higher taxes, higher deficits, and/or austerity measures like cuts on social welfare spending. Or they could not do any of that and risk the increased possibility of Russian tanks rolling through the streets of Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius again by the end of the decade. And nuclear deterrence will likely not be sufficient enough to deter the Russians on its own either, especially not if Trump effectively pulls the United States out of NATO and withdraws the American nuclear umbrella from Europe. France and the UK each have their own independent nuclear weapons arsenals, but would they actually threaten to use them over an invasion of the Baltic states? Is the fate of the Baltic states enough of a core strategic interest to Paris and London to risk civilizational-ending nuclear Armageddon over? The old Cold War logic of mutually assured.
Look, man, if the current president of France changes, I don't know, but the current guy is clearly aggressive enough to respond, right? Because he says where that's going, right? I don't know about UK, but UK usually, when it comes to military aggression like that, knowing the past of World War I, World War II, UK will probably answer as well somewhat. I don't see them staying away, having response same as Trump would, right? I think they would respond somewhat. France is already increasing that thing. So if the Baltic states get attacked, right, and it's time to become more increasingly, Poland gets involved. Yeah, I think the France and UK would respond. Would USA back them up? That would be the question, right? But I feel like if enough European country gets involved, even if USA doesn't get involved, would be enough. Because with the Ukraine and Russia thing right now, look at how poorly that is going. Obviously, a lot of US aid is important. And I think US aid is still going to be there. Even if US doesn't get involved, US aid, like they're aiding Ukraine, that would still go around, right? And that and enough European country being there would be enough to overpower Russia. If everything going right now, if you take that into account, right? What's going on with Russia and Ukraine, if you take all that in mind and think if Baltic state, Poland, and even France and UK gets involved, I think there'll be enough to fight off Russia with enough US aid. I think even if Russia becomes stronger with US aid and all this country involved, there'll be enough.
Destruction would once again apply here. France initially acquired their own nuclear weapons back in the 1960s out of their own calculus that the United States wouldn't ever risk New York for Paris. As in, the Americans wouldn't ever risk nuclear war over the fate of France. Paris reasoned that they needed their own nuclear weapons arsenal separate from the Americans to guarantee their own strategic autonomy. But the same logic would apply in reverse to a Russian attack on the Baltic states. Would France actually be willing to risk Paris for Narva, Tallinn, or Riga? If French and British nuclear threats over the status of the Baltics weren't considered credible enough by Moscow, and the continent's conventional military capabilities without the Americans' Hungarian slope.
Yeah, but this would imply that you're fearing that Putin would just point blank launch nukes without fearing one, right? Let's say France gets involved with the Baltic states, involved as in sends troops, tanks and things like that. Argument would be if that happens, Putin would just launch a nuke at Paris. But then again, France can also launch in response a nuke at Moscow. So, mutual destruction means two nuclear powers are not going to, throw nukes at each other. But what if one of the power sends aid into help with military, army, navy in that way without actually using nukes? If nobody use nukes, nobody's going to use nukes because there is no response here, right? So that whole is a gambling thing, right? Putin warning if you get involved, I'll use nukes. If they say fuck it, I'm gonna call your gamble and actually send troops, is Putin really going to throw nuke big scale city killing nukes? Because France can do that too to Moscow now. So would he fear that? I don't know.
Slovaks and potentially more were considered by Moscow to be weak enough, especially after a potential previous failure by the West to halt the Russian subjugation of Ukraine and Moldova, then European deterrence has a high probability of failure. And so the continent needs to have a strong and capable conventional military force to actually respond with to deter any invasion of the Baltic states from ever happening in the first place. In order to avoid this grim scenario across the European continent in the later 2020s and early 2030s from resembling the 1930s a century ago, the Europeans must do everything in their power today to ensure that the Russian war machine is stopped in Ukraine before the war has a chance to expand in the future. If the Russian army emerges completely victorious in Ukraine, then there is a high probability that by the end of the decade, Russian troops will be advancing through the Baltic states next, and the Europeans may be faced with a previously unimaginable decision: going into a full-scale war with Russia that will ravage Europe, or going down the path of appeasement that could lead to the collapse of NATO and the European Union as credible institutions forever. To date, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began more than 2 years ago, mostly Western nations have delivered more than $380 billion worth of financial aid to Ukraine, with nearly $118 billion of that amount being direct military aid. A massive amount of this aid was heavily concentrated by the Ukrainians in their major 2023 counteroffensive, an operation that was hoped to become a decisive turning point in the war that would see Ukrainian forces driving across the Russian-occupied territory in the south of the country to reach the Sea of Azov and split the Russian occupation of Ukraine into two separate, tougher-to-defend halves. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides took part in the operation from June of 2023 to the end of the year, in one of the largest military operations in Europe ever seen since the Second World War. But after months of brutal and heavy fighting, the Ukrainians only managed to recapture about 370 square kilometers of their territory in the face of significantly tougher than expected Russian defenses, falling very short of the initial goal of driving all the way towards the Sea of Azov. The next part of this video that covers how the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive went, why it ultimately failed, and what implications it's having for Ukraine's war effort today in 2024, is all vital context to understanding where the war in Europe is currently headed. But unfortunately, due to the inherently violent, controversial, and very recent nature of
yeah, well, go to original video paste link and from this support this channel, or go to go.nebula.tv/real life lore and support this channel. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, anytime I try to upload real life lore reaction, it usually has some kind of a restriction on it. So he's not, he's really right in that, like, he can't post that on YouTube. You have to watch it on Nebula, because 3 years ago some videos that get restricted wouldn't have restricted. Nowadays that's increasing somehow. It's like even somewhat talk of anything war related, or even showing a tank could be an issue. I've seen some video that gets restricted, I blur out just a tank, and that's enough to not get restricted. Like, what the fuck, you can't even show a tank now? How does that work? I don't know. But yeah. Right, well, that was how NATO and Russia are preparing to fight total war. I'm not gonna lie, after watching this video, I'm not feeling good. Because certain things just like, like a puzzle clicked in my head, thinking like, long, slow war could happen in the future. Right? Nukes can become a thing that you just use in smaller scale, and nobody might do anything. Trump might get into power, and I feel like Trump probably will come into power for many different reasons, but it feels more likely now, right? So Trump could say, fuck it, I'm not going to answer to Article 5 or something. So slow moving war could happen, right? The only reason war didn't happen after World War II was like point blank, like, like deterrence. Like, if you do this, everybody's dead, so nobody's going to try anything. But if you slowly try that and nobody does anything, then start the slow crushing wars all around the world, right? You have to respond quickly and like strongly to show the other side, like, don't fuck with this, otherwise it's gonna be bad. If you don't do that, it's gonna be slow crushing war, and I think that's what's gonna happen in the future. Nobody's gonna really go with all force and like strength, like, okay, you can do this, this is where I draw the line. Nobody's gonna do that. Just like nobody never does that in World War II, World War I, nobody's never does that. So slowly it will reach a point, it will be too much. Will it like just go to full-blown World War III? Who the fuck knows? But yeah, and the problem with that is like this war, World War III, let's call it, would be so slow that we won't realize it is a World War III until a few years, decades or few decades, right? Something happen in next 7 years, then something more happens in more next 7 years. Before you know, 15, 20 years have gone by, and now the full-scale war has begun. You can't even track that. That's how long it is. Yeah, there you go. Right, well, if you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.